At the checkout line of Whole Foods, I paid exactly $42 for an elderly woman groceries because her card was declined. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through my soul. She grabbed my wrist with a grip surprisingly strong for her age and pulled me close. Her voice was a raspy whisper that chilled me more than the Chicago wind outside. She said, "When your husband leaves, do not touch the snow in your yard." I laughed it off at the time, thinking she was just a senile old lady grateful for the charity. I should have listened. The very next morning, stepping onto the porch of my empty house, I nearly collapsed at what I saw buried under that white powder. Before I tell you how a patch of snow helped me send my husband to federal prison and become a millionaire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your kindness repaid with betrayal. My name is Nia, and at 32 years old, I thought I had it all. I am sitting here tonight in my penthouse living room wearing an emerald green silk robe that costs more than my ex-husband's car. I am sipping a vintage Pinot Noir and watching the snowflakes dance against the floor-to-ceiling windows. But 6 months ago, the view was very different. I live in Chicago, where the winters are unforgiving and the wind off Lake Michigan cuts through you like a knife. Just like my marriage to Marcus. To the outside world, we were the definition of Black excellence. Marcus was the charismatic software sales director, with the winning smile and the $5,000 suits. I was the supportive wife, working quietly as a health data analyst, making sure our home was perfect and our image was flawless. We lived in a stunning home in an upscale neighborhood where we were one of the few Black families. I worked double shifts to pay for the renovations, while Marcus spent his bonuses on maintaining appearances. I truly believed we were partners building an empire together. I ignored the late nights. I ignored the unexplained withdrawals from our joint account. I even ignored the way his mother looked at me, like I was something she stepped in. I thought love meant sacrifice. I did not know that while I was building a home, Marcus was digging a grave for our marriage. Tonight, the fire in my fireplace is warm, but my blood runs cold when I remember that specific Christmas Eve. The city was covered in a blanket of white, looking innocent and pure. But I learned the hard way that snow is the perfect accomplice. It covers the dirt. It hides the tracks. And sometimes, if you look closely enough, it reveals the secrets that people tried desperately to bury. As I looked out at my backyard that fateful morning, the pristine white surface was broken by something that should not have been there. And that one detail unraveled a web of lies that would destroy everyone who tried to hurt me. It was 10 o'clock the night before Christmas Eve, and the fluorescent lights of the Whole Foods market felt like they were burning straight through my retinas. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift, analyzing health data, and every muscle in my body was screaming for rest. The store was mostly empty, a hollow echo of the holiday chaos that had consumed the city earlier in the day. I dragged my feet toward the only open checkout lane, just wanting to buy a bottle of wine and go home to the silence of my empty kitchen. Ahead of me in line was an elderly Black woman who looked like she carried the weight of the entire world on her stooped shoulders. She was wearing a threadbare coat that was far too thin for the Chicago winter. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted out coins onto the conveyor belt. The cashier, a young girl with purple hair and zero patience, popped her gum loudly and sighed. She told the woman she was still short $42. The total was mostly for canned soup and cat food. The woman looked down at her worn-out coin purse with a desperation that made my chest tighten. She started to put back a small bag of oranges and a carton of milk. I stepped forward without a second thought. I told the cashier to keep them in the bag. I reached into my purse and pulled out my American Express black card. The heavy titanium clicked sharply against the countertop. It was the card Marcus insisted we have to show the world we had made it, even if our marriage was crumbling behind closed doors. The cashier raised her eyebrows, seeing the exclusive card, and then looking at me in my tired sweatpants, but she swiped it without a word. The elderly woman looked up slowly. Her eyes were milky with age, but there was a sharpness behind them that unsettled me. She stared at the card in my hand, reading the name embossed on the metal. Nia Vance. Her expression shifted instantly from gratitude to something darker, almost fearful. She reached out and grabbed my wrist. Her grip was shocking, iron hard, and ice cold. She did not say thank you. Instead, she leaned in close, smelling of lavender and old paper. Her voice was a raspy whisper that cut through the hum of the refrigerators. She said the snow hides the sins of the Vance men. When he leaves, do not touch the snow in your yard. I tried to pull my hand away, laughing nervously. I asked her what she meant, but she just let go and walked away toward the automatic doors, leaving her groceries on the counter. I stood there shaking in the middle of the checkout aisle. I told myself she was just a confused old lady suffering from dementia. I gathered my things and walked out into the freezing night. The wind hit my face, but it was not as cold as the feeling settling in my gut. I did not know it then, but that woman had just handed me the weapon I would use to destroy my husband. I got into my car and drove home to the man who I thought loved me, unaware that he was already packing his bags. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded like a funeral bell in the silence of the penthouse foyer. I stepped out and the air inside was somehow colder than the Chicago blizzard I had just escaped. It was not a physical cold, but a stillness so heavy it felt like it could crush my lungs. The scent of pine from our 12-foot Christmas tree was overpowered by the smell of expensive leather and aged bourbon. I dropped my keys on the marble console table, and the sound echoed too loudly in the vast open space. That was when I saw them. Lined up in the hallway like soldiers ready for deployment were 6 pieces of luggage. They were not just any bags. They were the hard-shell Louis Vuitton trunks Marcus had bought in Paris last year. The ones he said were too nice to check in at the airport. Now they were packed full, standing in a perfect row blocking the path to the living room. My heart hammered against my ribs. My first foolish thought was that he was surprising me with a holiday trip, maybe to the Maldives or St. Bart's like we had talked about. But then I saw the coat rack. My winter coats were still there, but his cashmere overcoat and his favorite scarf were gone. The closet door was slightly ajar, and even from here I could see the emptiness of the racks where his bespoke suits used to hang. I walked past the wall of luggage, my boots clicking on the hardwood floor. Marcus was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window in the living room. He had his back to me, staring out at the swirling snow and the city lights below. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his posture was rigid. In his right hand, he held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. I knew exactly what it was, exactly what it said. Blanton's single-barrel bourbon. It was the drink he saved for closing million-dollar deals or celebrating victories. He was not grieving. He was celebrating. I took a breath, trying to steady the tremor in my voice. I asked him what was going on. I asked him where he was going. He did not turn around immediately. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink and the ice cubes clinked against the glass. The sound was sharp and dismissive. He let the silence stretch out for 10 agonizing seconds, forcing me to stand there and wait for his acknowledgement. It was a power move he used on his sales team when they missed a quota. When he finally turned to face me, his expression was terrifyingly blank. There was no anger. There was no sadness. There was just a cold indifference, as if I were a stranger who had walked into his office by mistake. He looked at me and then looked past me at the luggage in the hall. He told me he was leaving. He said it with the same casual tone he used to order dinner. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer an explanation. He just stood there sipping his $60 bourbon while my entire world fractured into a million pieces. The warmth of the fireplace seemed to die instantly, leaving me shivering in my own home. I realized then that the man standing before me was not the husband I had married 5 years ago. This was a stranger wearing his face, and he had been planning this moment for a very long time. He set the crystal glass down on the coaster with a precision that made my skin crawl. He did not stutter. He did not look away. He looked me dead in the eyes, and told me that our marriage was an expired contract that he was choosing not to renew. He spoke with the cold efficiency of a corporate executioner firing an underperforming employee. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands started to tremble, so I clenched them into fists at my sides. I asked him if there was someone else. I expected him to deny it, or to give me the usual speech about growing apart. But Marcus just laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He told me I was smart enough to analyze big data, so surely I could analyze this. Then he dropped the name that shattered the last remnant of my dignity. Tiffany. I felt like the floor had opened up beneath me. Tiffany was not just a random woman from his office. She was 26 years old. She came from old money, and she was engaged to his younger brother, Andre. Their wedding was supposed to be in June. I had helped her pick out her dress just last week. I stared at him in horror, asking him how he could do that to his own brother. Marcus took a step closer to me, invading my personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and betrayal. He told me to stop being so dramatic about Andre. He said Andre would get over it because business is business and family is about legacy. That word hung in the air like smoke. Legacy. Then he delivered the blow that hurt more than the infidelity itself. He pointed a manicured finger at my stomach. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust that made me want to scream. He told me that he needed a son to carry on the Vance name. He said that while I had spent 5 years making excuses about my thyroid condition and crying over negative pregnancy tests, Tiffany had simply delivered results. He smirked as he told me she was already 3 months pregnant. It is a boy. The cruelty of his words left me breathless. He was blaming me for a medical condition I could not control while boasting about impregnating his brother's fiancée. He told me that his mother already knew. He said she was thrilled to finally have a grandson, and that she agreed it was time for him to upgrade to a woman who actually functioned as a wife should. He called me a dud. He said he had wasted 5 years waiting for a miracle that my broken body could not provide. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a thick white envelope. He tossed it onto the coffee table. It landed on top of the architectural magazines I had bought for our renovation plans. He told me those were the divorce papers. He had drawn them up weeks ago while I was working double shifts to pay off his credit card debt. He looked at his watch as if I were wasting his time. He said I should sign them quickly unless I wanted to be embarrassed in court. I looked at the papers and then back at the stranger standing in my living room. I realized then that the man I loved had died a long time ago. This monster in front of me was something else entirely. I stared at the divorce papers and my survival instinct finally kicked in. I grabbed my phone and opened our banking app. My fingers flew across the screen. Login failed. User access revoked. I tried my credit card app next. The American Express Black Card that I had just used to buy groceries for a stranger was now a worthless piece of metal. The screen flashed a red notification stating that the primary account holder had suspended all supplementary cards. I looked up at Marcus. He was scrolling through his phone looking bored. He told me not to bother. He said he had moved the funds to an offshore holding account an hour ago. He said that since Illinois is an equitable distribution state, he was just protecting his assets from a gold digger. He called me a gold digger. Me. The woman who paid the mortgage while he launched his startup. The woman who ate ramen noodles so he could buy client dinners. He walked over to his wallet, which was sitting on the mantelpiece. He pulled out a few crisp bills. He walked back to me and tossed them onto the glass coffee table. They fluttered down, settling next to the divorce papers. I counted them with my eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. $500. He smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said that should be enough for a taxi to your mother's house and maybe a warm meal. He told me to leave the keys to the Mercedes because the lease was in his company's name. He said I could take my clothes, but the jewelry stayed because it was considered an investment. I stood there frozen. In the span of 10 minutes, I had gone from being the mistress of a penthouse to a woman with $500 to her name and nowhere to go. The humiliation burned hotter than anger. He was not just leaving me, he was erasing me. He was stripping me of every resource I had, so I would be too broken to fight back. He thought he had taken everything. He thought money was the only power that mattered. But as I looked at those $500, I felt something inside me harden into steel. He had made a fatal mistake. He had left me with nothing to lose. The silence in the room was broken by the harsh buzzing of Marcus' phone. It sat on the coffee table between us like a grenade waiting to explode. He did not just answer it. He tapped the screen and cast the video call to the 85-inch television mounted above the fireplace. The screen flickered to life, and there she was. Joyce, my mother-in-law. Her face loomed over the room, distorted by the angle of the camera, making her look like a caricature of evil. She did not look surprised to see her son packing his bags. She did not ask why her daughter-in-law was standing there with tears streaming down her face. Instead, she smiled. It was a tight, satisfied smile. She asked him if he had finally cut the dead weight. Marcus nodded, taking another sip of his bourbon. He told her it was done. Joyce turned her gaze toward me through the screen. Her eyes were cold and hard like flint. She told me not to look at her with those sad puppy dog eyes. She said I should have seen this coming. I asked her how she could support this. I asked her about Andre, her other son, whose fiancée was currently pregnant by Marcus. Joyce waved her hand dismissively as if I were a buzzing fly. She said Andre would understand because he knew what was best for the family legacy. Then she leaned closer to the camera and her voice dropped to a cruel whisper. She said Tiffany is a blessing, Nia. She is a savior for this bloodline. She is giving us a healthy grandson. Then came the insults that she had clearly been saving for years. She looked at me with pure disdain. She said I was a barren field. She called me a poisonous tree that refused to bear fruit. She said that in the Bible, a fig tree that produces nothing is cut down and thrown into the fire. She told Marcus he was right to prune the branches that were sucking the life out of him. She praised Tiffany for her youth and her fertility, completely ignoring the immorality of the situation. To Joyce, nothing mattered except the air. I stood there listening to them discuss my disposal. I realized then that this was not a sudden affair. This was a conspiracy. The Sunday dinners where she kissed my cheek. The times she asked about my fertility treatments feigning concern. It was all a lie. She had been rooting for my failure the entire time. She had been grooming Tiffany to replace me behind my back. They were not just a family. They were a pack of wolves, and I was the carcass they had finished picking clean. Joyce ended the call with one final command. She told Marcus to make sure he took the good silver cutlery, because she never liked the idea of me touching it anyway. The screen went black, but the echo of her cruelty hung in the air, suffocating me. I was alone in a room with a man who hated me and a family that had erased me. The heavy oak door clicked shut, and the sound echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wood grain, waiting for him to come back. I was waiting for him to say it was just a sick joke or a cruel test of my loyalty, but the only sound was the faint hum of the elevator taking my husband and his Louis Vuitton trunks down to the garage. He was gone. The man I had built my entire life around had just walked out, leaving me with nothing but $500 and a broken heart. I sank to the floor right there in the hallway. The expensive Persian rug that I had spent months saving for now felt rough against my cheek. I pulled my knees to my chest and let out a scream that had been building in my throat for the last hour. It was a raw, animalistic sound of pure grief. I looked around the sprawling living room. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the custom furniture, the art on the walls. It all felt like a movie set for a production that had just been canceled. I felt incredibly small. I was insignificant. I was a trespasser in my own home. I cried until my throat burned and my eyes were swollen shut. The fire in the fireplace had died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I wrapped my arms around myself, rocking back and forth. My mind was racing, trying to process the financial ruin and the humiliation. But then, through the fog of my misery, a strange memory surfaced. It was the rasping voice of the old woman at the grocery store. Ms. Hattie. Her words replayed in my head with terrifying clarity. When he leaves, do not touch the snow in your yard. It was such a bizarre thing to say, a nonsensical warning from a stranger. But in the silence of this empty house, it felt less like nonsense and more like a prophecy. Why would she say that? What did she know about Marcus? What did she know about the Vance men? I pushed myself up from the floor. My legs felt heavy and weak. I walked slowly toward the massive glass wall that overlooked the backyard. Outside, the blizzard had stopped, but the wind was still howling. The city lights of Chicago twinkled in the distance, indifferent to my pain. I looked down at our private garden. It was a pristine blanket of white, a perfect, untouched canvas of snow under the moonlight. It looked peaceful. It looked innocent. But as I pressed my hand against the cold glass, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The snow was hiding something. Marcus had been so eager to leave. He had taken the money. He had taken the car. But he had left something behind. I stared into the darkness of the yard, and for the first time that night, I stopped crying. The tears dried up and were replaced by a cold, hard curiosity. I was going to find out what was buried under that snow even if I had to dig with my bare hands. The morning sun filtered through the heavy velvet curtains, but it brought no warmth to the master bedroom. I woke up reaching for a body that was no longer there. The sheets on Marcus' side of the bed were cold and smooth, undisturbed by sleep. For a split second, I thought it was just a nightmare, but then the reality of the previous night crashed down on me like a physical blow. The divorce papers, the empty closet, the $500 on the table. I dragged myself out of bed, my body aching as if I had run a marathon. I wrapped my silk robe tighter around myself and walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass doors that opened onto the small balcony overlooking our backyard. The blizzard had finally stopped, leaving Chicago buried under 2 feet of pristine white snow. From the second floor, the world looked deceptively peaceful. The neighbors' yards were perfect, untouched squares of white, glistening like diamond dust in the sharp morning light. I looked down at our own yard, expecting to see the same perfection. At first glance, it looked normal. The privacy fence was frosted with ice, and the old oak tree in the corner stood like a skeleton against the gray sky. But then my eyes caught a disruption in the pattern. It was subtle, something a casual observer might miss, but I am a data analyst. I am trained to spot anomalies and patterns, and this was a glaring error in the landscape. Near the back corner of the yard, right next to the trellis where my prize-winning climbing roses were currently dormant, there was a rectangular patch. It was perfectly geometrical, about 3 feet wide and 5 feet long. The snow there was not fluffy and white like the rest of the yard. It was sunken, slightly depressed, below the level of the surrounding snow. The surface looked gray and slushy, as if the ground beneath it was warmer than the frozen earth around it. My heart started to pound in my chest. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass. Physics class from high school came rushing back to me. Disturbed soil has a different thermal conductivity than packed earth. When you dig a hole and fill it back up, the air pockets trap heat, causing the snow on top to melt faster. Someone had been digging in my garden, recently. I stared at that gray rectangle and a chill went through me that had nothing to do with the drafty window. The shape was too deliberate to be an animal burrowing. It was too large to be a simple hole for planting a shrub. The dimensions were terrifyingly specific. It was exactly the size of a large floor safe, or a coffin. Miss Hattie's voice echoed in my mind louder than ever. Do not touch the snow. She knew. Somehow that old woman knew exactly what Marcus had done. He had not just left. He had buried something. And looking at that sinking patch of gray slush, I realized he had been in a rush. He had done a sloppy job counting on the blizzard to cover his tracks. But he had underestimated the physics of the soil, and he had definitely underestimated his wife. I stood there watching the steam rise faintly from the patch, realizing that my garden was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene. My hand was already on the cold metal handle of the sliding glass door. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run out there. I wanted to grab the garden shovel from the shed and tear into that frozen earth until I exposed whatever dirty secret Marcus had buried. I imagined feeling the metal strike something hard. I imagined the vindication of holding the proof in my hands. My breath fogged up the glass in front of me as I unlocked the latch with a sharp click. The sound seemed deafening in the silent house. I slid the door open just an inch. The freezing air rushed in instantly, biting at my bare toes and stinging my face. It smelled of ice and pine. The temptation was overwhelming. It was right there. The answers to 5 years of lies were sitting just 20 feet away, under a thin layer of slush. All I had to do was step out, 1 step, 2 steps, dig. It would be so easy to end the suspense right now. My muscles coiled, ready to spring into action. I was desperate for truth. I was desperate for revenge. But then the old woman voice echoed in my head like a warning bell. Do not touch the snow. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. I froze. My hand gripped the handle so tight my knuckles turned white. I looked down at the pristine white expanse between the patio and that disturbing gray patch. It was a perfect canvas. It was flawless. I realized with a jolt of terror what I was about to do. If I walked out there now, I would leave footprints. Deep, undeniable footprints in the fresh snow leading directly from my door to his secret. Marcus was coming back. He had to come back for whatever was buried there. If he returned and saw tracks leading directly to his hiding spot, he would know that I knew. He would know the game was up. The element of surprise was the only weapon I had left. If he knew I was onto him, he would move the assets, or worse, he might hurt me to keep me quiet. I pulled my hand back as if the door handle were red-hot iron. I slid the glass shut and locked it with trembling fingers. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I took a step back into the safety of the warm living room, breathing hard. I looked down at my bare feet. They were safe. No tracks, no evidence. I had almost blown the entire game before it had even started. I needed to be smarter than him. I needed to be patient. I could not be the emotional wife digging in the yard like a manic woman. I had to be the data analyst. I needed to observe without interacting. I needed to collect data without corrupting the sample. I backed away from the window, keeping my eyes fixed on the yard. The gray patch mocked me, but I forced myself to turn away. I would find out what was down there, but I would not do it with a shovel, not yet. I would watch the snow, but I would never touch it. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hands finally steadying. I had survived the first test. I had controlled the impulse. Now I needed a plan that did not involve physical labor. I needed eyes on that yard that Marcus could not see. I sat at the white marble kitchen island, staring at my reflection in the black screen of my phone. The house was silent, but my phone was vibrating against the countertop like an angry hornet. It had been buzzing non-stop for the last 10 minutes. I did not have to look at the caller ID to know who it was. It was Tiffany. She was not content with taking my husband and my home. She wanted to twist the knife. She wanted to make sure I felt every ounce of my replacement. I finally flipped the phone over. The screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. She had sent a series of photos. The first one was a grainy black and white ultrasound image. Underneath it, she had typed a caption that made my stomach turn. Future CEO of Vance Enterprises. She was already claiming the legacy that I had helped build. She was already placing her unborn child on the throne that Marcus had denied me. Then came the texts. They were not screaming insults. They were worse. They were polite, passive-aggressive observations that were dripping with the kind of racism that tries to disguise itself as concern. She wrote that she was just leaving the doctor and that Marcus was so relieved that the baby was measuring big and healthy. Then came the second message. She said Marcus is so happy that he does not have to worry about the genetic lottery anymore. We both agreed that a lighter complexion will open so many more doors for him in the corporate world. No offense intended, Nia, but you know how hard it is for people with your look to be taken seriously in the boardroom. I felt the heat rise up my neck. My look, she meant my dark skin. She meant the melanin that Marcus used to tell me was beautiful until he decided it was a liability, but she was not done. The three dots appeared and disappeared as she typed her final insult. She sent a photo of herself touching her long, straight blonde hair. The text read, "I am just so glad he will have my hair texture. I would hate for him to struggle with unmanageable hair like yours. Braids are cute for you, sweetie, but we want him to look professional from day one." My hand shook as I held the phone. It was not just about the affair anymore. This was about erasure. Tiffany did not just want to be Marcus' wife. She wanted to breathe the blackness out of his bloodline. She saw me not just as a rival, but as a genetic defect that needed to be corrected. She thought she was safe behind her screen. She thought she was superior because of her biology. She had no idea that while she was bragging about her genetics, I was looking out the window at the snow that covered a felony. She was worried about hair texture, while her future husband was worried about federal prison. I took a screenshot of every single message. I saved every photo. She wanted to talk about opening doors for her child. I was about to close every door in her face. I set the phone down and looked back out at the yard. The anger that had been burning inside me turned into ice. I was done crying. It was time to get to work. I ran to Marcus's home office. The room smelled of his expensive leather chair and the stale, lingering scent of his secrets. I did not turn on the lights. I did not want the neighbors to see me frantic. I used the flashlight on my phone and started tearing through his closet. I knew Marcus. He was a man who loved toys but had no patience for learning how to use them. He bought gadgets to impress people and then threw them into storage when the novelty wore off. I prayed that his lack of attention span would be my salvation today. I yanked open the top shelf of his custom-built storage unit, old camera lenses, a virtual reality headset he used once. And then I saw it, the hard black case of his DJI Mavic Pro drone. I pulled it down with trembling hands. I unzipped the case and checked the battery indicator. 2 bars. It was enough. Thank God for lithium batteries. I carried the drone back to the kitchen and set it on the island. My hands were moving with a speed and precision I did not know I possessed. I connected the controller to my iPad and powered up the device. The propellers twitched and the green status light blinked on. I walked to the sliding glass door again. I unlocked it and opened it just 6 inches. The cold air rushed in, but I did not care. I placed the drone on the floor just inside the threshold. I pushed the joystick forward. The drone buzzed to life, sounding like a swarm of angry bees. It lifted off the floor, hovering steadily. I guided it through the narrow opening and out into the freezing Chicago air. I stared at my iPad screen. The 4K camera sent back a crystal clear feed. It was like I was floating 10 feet in the air. I maneuvered the drone over the patio furniture and past the frozen fountain. I brought it to a hover directly above the back corner of the yard. My heart was in my throat. On the screen, the gray patch looked even more ominous. I tilted the camera gimbal straight down. I zoomed in. The high-resolution lens revealed what my naked eye from the window could not. The snow was not just melted, it was mixed with something else. I saw streaks of a white, powdery substance that was distinct from the snow crystals. It looked chalky and granular. I knew what that was immediately. It was garden lime. My stomach dropped. You do not use garden lime in the middle of winter. You use lime to break down organic matter. You use it to mask the smell of decomposition. Marcus had not just buried money or documents, he had prepared the ground as if he were burying a body. The white powder was scattered hastily around the edges of the sunken earth. He must have poured it in the hole before filling it back up. I hit the record button on the screen. I took high-resolution photos from every angle. I flew the drone lower until it was just inches above the slush, capturing the texture of the disturbed soil. I had the evidence. I had the proof that he had dug a hole large enough for a coffin and filled it with chemicals meant to hide a stench. And the best part was that the snow around the patch remained perfectly smooth. I had walked right up to his secret without taking a single step outside. I brought the drone back inside and shut the door. As I reviewed the footage, I realized that my husband was not just a thief, he was something far more dangerous. I tracked Ms. Hattie down to a crumbling brick row house on the south side of the city. I parked my luxury SUV between a rusted pickup truck and a pile of uncollected trash. I watched the front door through my rearview mirror, feeling completely out of place. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my leather gloves creaked. I did not know what I was doing here. I was chasing the cryptic words of a stranger, but desperation makes you do irrational things. Ms. Hattie stepped out onto her porch before I even turned off the engine. She was wrapped in a thick wool shawl, and she held a cigarette in one trembling hand. She motioned for me to roll down the window. She did not say hello. She reached into the pocket of her housecoat and pulled out a crumpled piece of thermal paper. She leaned into the window and dropped it onto the passenger seat. I picked it up and smoothed it out. It was a receipt from the hardware store dated 3 days before Christmas. The items listed made my blood run cold. 1 heavy-duty steel spade, 1 50-pound bag of agricultural lime, 1 box of industrial rubber gloves. I looked up at her confused. I asked her where she got this. She took a long drag of her cigarette and blew the smoke into the cold air. She told me that my husband was in line ahead of her at the store. She said he was so busy flirting with the young cashier on his phone that he dropped the receipt when he pulled out his wallet. She picked it up, intending to give it back to him, but then she saw what he had bought. She said a man buying lime in the middle of winter is only planning one thing. He is planning to hide something that rots. I stared at the receipt. The date and time were stamped clearly at the bottom, but Ms. Hattie was not done. She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. She told me she saw him again. She said she was walking home late on Christmas Eve because the buses had stopped running. She took the shortcut through the alley behind my gated community. She saw him through the gaps in the fence. She said it was 3 in the morning. She said Marcus was out there in the freezing wind, digging like a man possessed. She watched him pour the white powder into the hole. She watched him cover it up and stomp the snow down until it looked flat. She said he looked terrified. She told me that whatever is in that hole is enough to put him away for a long time. She told me to be careful because a man that desperate is dangerous. She tapped the side of my car twice and walked back into her house without another word. I sat there in the silence, staring at the receipt that proved my husband was not just a cheater. He was a criminal mastermind who had made one sloppy mistake. The automatic doors of the CVS pharmacy slid open, and the smell of rubbing alcohol and cheap candy hit me like a physical blow. My head was swimming. The stress of the last 24 hours had triggered a flare-up of my thyroid condition. My joints ached and a thick mental fog was beginning to cloud my thoughts. I needed my medication. I needed the levothyroxine that kept my body functioning. I walked to the counter where Gary, the pharmacist who had known me for 3 years, was typing on his computer. He looked up and smiled, but his expression quickly soured when he looked at his screen. He lowered his voice, looking uncomfortable. He told me there was a problem. He said my insurance had been declined. The system showed that my coverage was terminated effective yesterday at midnight. I gripped the cold laminate counter to steady myself. Terminated. Marcus had not just cut off my money, he had cut off my health. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that without this medication, my metabolism would crash. My hair would fall out. I would slip into a depression so deep I would not be able to get out of bed, let alone fight him in court. This was not just a financial tactic, it was biological warfare. He was trying to disable me physically so I would be too weak to challenge him. I asked Gary how much the prescription cost out of pocket. He winced before answering. He said it was $428 for a 90-day supply. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had exactly $500 in my wallet. The $500 Marcus had thrown at me like I was a cheap prostitute. If I bought this medicine, I would have less than $80 to my name. I would not be able to afford a motel. I would barely be able to afford food. I certainly could not afford a lawyer. I looked at the line of people behind me. I looked at the pity in Gary's eyes. I realized Marcus' plan. He wanted me to call him. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to crawl back to him shivering and sick so he could dictate the terms of my surrender. He wanted to be the benevolent savior who would reinstate my insurance only if I signed his unfair settlement. He was banking on my survival instinct forcing me into submission. But he had miscalculated. He forgot that I survived a childhood where we had to choose between heat and food. I reached into my purse. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. They were shaking with a rage so hot it burned through the brain fog. I pulled out the crisp $100 bills. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I slapped them onto the counter. I told Gary to ring it up. I took the bottle of white pills. As I swallowed the first one dry right there in the aisle, I made a vow. Marcus tried to take my breath away. Now I was going to take his life away. Not his physical life, but the life he built on lies and my hard work. I walked out of that pharmacy with $72 in my pocket. I was broke, but I was no longer broken. The medicine would kick in soon, and when it did, I would be ready for war. I stood in front of the master bathroom mirror, gripping the edges of the cold granite vanity until my knuckles turned white. The woman staring back at me looked fierce. Her eyes were burning with the fire of newfound purpose, and her jaw was set in a hard line of determination. But that woman could not make this phone call. Marcus needed to hear the broken wife. He needed to hear the pathetic, dependent creature he believed he had created. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I visualized every moment of insecurity I had ever felt. I summoned the memory of every time he made me feel small. When I opened my eyes, the fire was gone. My shoulders slumped. My lower lip trembled. I looked devastated. It was the performance of a lifetime, and the audience was a man who thought he knew everything about me. I picked up my phone and dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. He did not say hello. He just breathed into the phone, waiting for me to break the silence. I let my voice crack perfectly on the first syllable. I whispered his name. I told him he won. I told him I had just come from the pharmacy and realized I could not survive without him. I told him I was scared and broke, and I did not have the energy to fight his lawyers. Marcus let out a short, arrogant laugh that grated against my ear. He told me he knew this phone call was coming. He said he gave me 24 hours, but I barely lasted 12. He asked if I was ready to stop being stubborn and accept my reality. I swallowed back the bile rising in my throat and forced a sob. I told him yes. I told him I would sign the divorce papers exactly as they were written. I would take nothing. No alimony, no share of the house, no claim on his future earnings. All I asked for was to stay in the house until Friday night, so I could pack my things and find a shelter. He was silent for a moment, calculating. I held my breath. Friday was the night of the blizzard. Friday was the night he needed to dig. If I was gone by Friday evening, the house would be empty for him. It was exactly what he wanted. He spoke again, his voice dripping with condescension. He said that was a wise decision, Nia. He said he was glad I finally recognized my place. He agreed to let me stay until Friday at 6 in the evening. He told me to leave the signed papers on the kitchen counter and the keys under the mat. He said he would unlock a small allowance for moving expenses once he verified I was gone. I thanked him. I actually thanked the man who was stealing my life. I hung up the phone and watched my reflection transform instantly. The tears evaporated. The slump in my shoulders disappeared. I stood tall again. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Marcus thought I was a defeated woman begging for scraps. He had no idea I was the spider, and he had just walked willingly into the center of my web. He thought Friday was his victory lap. He did not know it was going to be his funeral. I parked my car in front of a nondescript brick building on the edge of the business district. There were no marble floors or valet parking here. The sign on the frosted glass door simply read, David Rossi Forensic Accounting and Legal Services. David was an old friend from college who had traded a high-flying corporate career for a small practice, helping women find the money their husbands tried to hide. He was the only person I trusted to handle a bomb this size without detonating it prematurely. I laid everything out on his cluttered oak desk: the divorce papers, the receipt for the lime, the high-definition drone photos of the sunken earth in my backyard. David adjusted his glasses and studied the images in silence for a long time. The only sound in the room was the ticking of an old grandfather clock and the hum of the hard drive where he was backing up my evidence. He did not look shocked. He looked like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. He finally looked up and his expression was grim. He told me that I had two choices. Option one was to confront Marcus now with the cheating and the hidden assets. He said Marcus would likely settle out of court, giving me half of the money just to keep me quiet. I shook my head immediately. Half was not enough. I did not want a settlement. I wanted justice. I wanted to burn his world down. David nodded slowly, as if he expected that answer. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. He told me that option two was dangerous, but the payoff would be absolute. He explained that in the state of Illinois, hiding assets during a divorce proceeding is a serious crime. But it only becomes a felony once he lies about it under oath. David pointed at the divorce papers where Marcus had listed his assets as zero. He said, "Right now, this is just a piece of paper with a lie on it. We need him to say it to a judge. We need him to commit perjury." The plan David outlined was terrifyingly simple. We were going to do absolutely nothing. We were going to let Marcus walk into the courtroom and lie. We were going to let him swear on a Bible that he was bankrupt. We were going to let him dig his own grave with his words, just like he dug that hole in the yard with a shovel. David tapped the photo of the gray snow. He said that if Marcus really buried millions of dollars in company funds there, it is not just a divorce case anymore. It is federal embezzlement and tax evasion. He told me that if we play this right, Marcus will not just lose his house. He will lose his freedom. David looked me in the eye and asked if I had the stomach for this. He warned me that I would have to endure humiliation in court without reacting. I would have to sit there and let Marcus call me a leech while I held the evidence that could destroy him. I thought about the ultrasound photo Tiffany sent me. I thought about the $500 on the table. I looked back at David and told him to draw up the paperwork. We were not just filing a motion, we were setting a trap, and Marcus was already walking right into it. The sound of the front door unlocking made my heart stop. I knew Marcus was at his office packing up his things, so it could not be him. I stood in the middle of the living room holding a roll of packing tape as the heavy door swung open. It was not my husband. It was Tiffany. She stood there, framed by the doorway, wearing a white cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first car. She held up a gold key, dangling it from her manicured finger, with a smirk that made my blood boil. She did not knock. She did not apologize. She just walked in, like she already owned the deed to the property. I looked down at her feet. She was wearing designer stilettos, but she had clearly just walked through the slush in the driveway. She stepped onto my pristine white Moroccan wool rug, leaving a dark smear of mud and gray sludge with every step. She did not even look down. She walked past me without saying a word and started surveying the living room like a building inspector looking for code violations. She ran a finger along the back of my velvet sofa and wrinkled her nose. She finally spoke, and her voice was like nails on a chalkboard. She said Marcus gave her the key so she could get a head start on measuring for renovations. She said she wanted to have the contractors ready to start the minute I was gone, because the current aesthetic was frankly depressing. She used the word heavy. She said the colors were too heavy. She looked at the Afrocentric art pieces I had collected over years of travel. She called them tribal. She said they made the place look cluttered and cheap. She turned to me and sighed dramatically. She said, "No offense, Nia, but this whole vibe is just so ghetto fabulous." She said it might have worked for Marcus when he was starting out, but now that he is entering politics, he needs a home that screams elegance, not urban struggle. She said she planned to replace everything with beige and cream. She wanted to erase every trace of my culture and my taste from the house. I felt my fingernails digging into the palms of my hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by her expensive coat and throw her out into the snow. I wanted to rub her face in the mud she had tracked onto my rug. The disrespect was physical. It was a violation of my sanctuary, but I forced myself to breathe. I forced myself to remember David Rossi words. Let them dig their own graves. Every insult she threw at me was just another shovel full of dirt. I unclenched my fists and forced a tight smile. I asked her if she would like some tea while she looked around. She looked at me with surprise as if the furniture had suddenly started talking. She laughed and said she would take a green tea but make sure it is bottled water because tap water is disgusting. I turned toward the kitchen, my body trembling with suppressed rage. She thought she was the queen surveying her new kingdom. She had no idea she was walking through a crime scene, and I was the one holding the evidence. I went to boil the water, knowing that in a few days, the only thing she would be drinking was lukewarm tap water from a prison cell. I watched Tiffany reach into her designer handbag and pull out a sleek silver cigarette case. She tapped a long, thin cigarette against the metal box and looked around the kitchen with a bored expression. She told me that the air in here was stifling and she needed a smoke. She turned on her heel and began walking straight toward the sliding glass door at the back of the living room. My heart hammered against my ribs. That door did not just lead to the patio, it led directly to the rectangular patch of melting snow where Marcus had buried his future and my past. Time seemed to slow down as she approached the glass. I saw her hand reach out for the latch. Her long red fingernails looked like claws ready to tear open my secret. If she stepped out there, two things would happen. First, she would leave footprints in the pristine snow, destroying the evidence that no one had entered the yard since the blizzard. Second, she might notice the gray sludge, or worse, the smell of the lime that had not fully settled. She was standing just inches away from the truth. I could see the condensation on the glass from her breath. I was paralyzed. I could not tackle her. I could not scream at her to stop without sounding insane. I needed a distraction, and I needed it instantly. I was standing by the kitchen island holding the electric kettle I had just boiled for her tea. The steam was rising from the spout, hot and angry. I looked at the kettle and then at the distance between me and the floor. It was a split-second decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation I had. I took a step forward and deliberately hooked my foot around the leg of the bar stool. As I felt my balance tip, I did not fight it. I let gravity take over. I threw my weight forward and released my grip on the handle of the kettle just enough to lose control, but not enough to burn my face. I hit the hardwood floor with a bone-jarring crash. The kettle flew from my hand and hit the cabinets with a deafening metallic clang. Boiling water sprayed across the floor and splashed onto my lower leg. The pain was immediate and searing. It was not an act. I screamed. I let out a shriek of genuine agony that tore through the silent house. I curled into a ball, clutching my shins, sobbing loudly. Tiffany froze. Her hand was resting on the lock of the sliding door, but she whipped around at the sound of the crash. She looked at me lying in a puddle of steaming water surrounded by broken ceramic from the tea mugs I had knocked over. For a second, I thought she might actually show concern. But then her face twisted into a mask of annoyance. She pulled her hand away from the door handle. She walked over to where I was writhing on the floor, but she did not bend down to help. She stepped carefully around the puddle of water, protecting her suede boots. She looked down at me and sighed. She asked me if I was serious. She called me clumsy. She said this was exactly why Marcus needed a wife with grace. She complained that the steam was going to ruin her blowout. She put the unlit cigarette back in its case and snapped it shut. She told me she had lost her appetite for fresh air. She said she was leaving because she could not deal with this level of chaos. She stepped over my injured leg and walked to the front door without looking back. I listened to the click of her heels fading away. I lay there on the wet floor, my leg throbbing with burns, but I started to laugh through my tears. The door was still locked. The snow was still untouched. I was hurt, but my secret was safe. The house was finally quiet. The only light in the living room came from the glow of my dual monitor setup, casting a ghostly blue pallor over my face. My injured leg was propped up on a pillow, throbbing in time with my heartbeat, but I pushed the pain to the back of my mind. I was in my element now. Marcus might be a smooth talker in the boardroom, but when it came to digital hygiene, he was sloppy. He assumed that because he had locked me out of the bank accounts, he was safe. He forgot that I spent my days hunting for anomalies in massive healthcare databases. Finding a hidden folder on a shared cloud server was child's play for me. I flexed my fingers and started typing. I bypassed his weak two-factor authentication using an old recovery email he had forgotten to update. It was an email account we had set up together years ago for our wedding planning. I was in. I navigated through his personal drive past the folders labeled taxes and receipts. I was looking for the shadow data, the files that did not want to be found. I ran a script to search for large file transfers and recent encryption activities. A folder popped up labeled System 3D2. To an amateur, it would look like a boring system file. To me, it was a red flag because it was sitting in a user directory where it did not belong. I decrypted it. The password was painfully predictable. It was Tiffany followed by her birth year. The disrespect fueled my focus. The folder opened and my jaw tightened. It was not pornography or love letters. It was a ledger. A detailed complex spreadsheet tracking the systematic siphoning of funds from Vance Enterprises. I scrolled through the rows of data. He had been moving money for 18 months. Small amounts at first, then larger chunks disguised as vendor payments to shell companies. But the last entry dated 3 days ago was the smoking gun. Liquidation of assets. $3.2 million. I clicked on the subfolder. There were receipts from a high-end bullion dealer in Switzerland and a diamond broker in Antwerp. He had not transferred the money to another bank where the IRS could freeze it. He had converted over $3 million of stolen company funds into gold bars and loose diamonds. Physical assets. Untraceable. Heavy. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window at the darkness of the yard. It all made perfect sense now. The heavy-duty spade. The large floor safe. The lime to confuse cadaver dogs if anyone came sniffing. He had not buried a body. He had buried his retirement fund. He had buried the evidence of grand larceny. Marcus was planning to divorce me, claim bankruptcy in court, and then once the dust settled, dig up his treasure and run off into the sunset with Tiffany and their golden child. He thought he was a genius. He thought he had committed the perfect crime. I looked at the glowing screen and smiled. I downloaded every single file to an encrypted external drive. He had stolen $3 million from his investors, but he was about to pay a much higher price. I had the map to his treasure, and I had the proof of his crime. Now I just needed to make sure he was the one holding the shovel when the police arrived. The air in the Cook County courtroom was stale and smelled faintly of floor wax and old misery. I sat at the plaintiff table next to David Rossi, keeping my head down and my shoulders slumped. To the world, I looked like a defeated woman about to lose everything. But under the table, my hands were clasped together to stop them from shaking, not with fear, but with anticipation. Across the aisle, Marcus sat next to his high-priced divorce attorney. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit that I knew cost $4,000, but he had deliberately left off his Rolex and his diamond cufflinks. He was playing the part of the struggling businessman perfectly. The Honorable Judge Patterson adjusted his glasses and looked down at the pile of documents Marcus's lawyer had just submitted. The silence in the room was heavy. I watched the judge flip through the pages of the financial affidavit. This was the document that would seal Marcus's fate. In the state of Illinois, lying on this specific form is not just a clerical error. It is a crime. Marcus's lawyer stood up, buttoning his jacket. He spoke with a smooth, practiced tone that made my skin crawl. He told the judge that his client was the victim of a volatile market. He claimed that Vance Enterprises had suffered catastrophic losses in the fourth quarter due to a failed software launch and withdrawn investor funding. He painted a picture of a man drowning in debt. He stated that the penthouse was leveraged to the hilt and the bank accounts were empty. He concluded by saying that Mr. Vance has a current net worth of $0 and therefore cannot pay spousal support. I looked at Marcus. He had practiced his expression in the mirror, I was sure of it. He looked somber. He looked humble. He nodded along with his lawyer's lies, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. If I did not know about the System 32 folder and the $3 million in diamonds buried next to my rose bushes, I might have actually felt sorry for him. The judge looked over his spectacles at Marcus. He asked him directly if he affirmed that the financial statement was true and complete to the best of his knowledge. This was the moment. The trap was set and the bait was dangling right in front of him. All he had to do was tell the truth, and he would only lose half his money. But Marcus was too greedy. He stood up and looked the judge in the eye. He said, "Yes, Your Honor." He said, "I have lost everything, and I am barely scraping by." David Rossi nudged my knee gently under the table. It was our signal. We did not object. We did not produce the evidence yet. We let the lie hang in the air and become part of the official court record. The court stenographer typed every word cementing his perjury into history. By claiming he had zero assets, Marcus had just legally abandoned his claim to anything not listed on that paper, including the contents of the safe in my backyard. He thought he was protecting his fortune from me. In reality, he had just legally gifted it to whoever found it. I kept my face buried in my hands, pretending to cry, but behind my fingers I was smiling. The preliminary hearing was over and the noose was tight around his neck. Marcus approached the witness stand with the swagger of a man who believed his own press release. He buttoned his jacket and ran a hand through his freshly cut hair. He looked at the Bible sitting on the ledge not as a holy book, but as a prop in his performance. He placed his left hand on the leather cover and raised his right hand. The bailiff recited the oath. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" Marcus looked the judge in the eye and said, "I do." His voice was steady and deep, projected perfectly for the courtroom. But from where I sat just 10 feet away, I could see the truth. A single bead of sweat had broken free from his hairline and was slowly trickling down his temple. It was the only crack in his armor. He was terrified. He sat down and the questioning began. His lawyer walked him through the financial statement line by line. It was a masterpiece of fiction. Marcus described how his investors pulled out. He described the market crash that allegedly wiped out his 401k. He spoke with a tremble in his voice about how hard he had tried to save the company, only to fail. He looked over at me with sad puppy dog eyes, shaking his head, as if he wished he could give me the world but simply had nothing left to give. It was disgusting. It was brilliant. Then the judge leaned forward. He peered over his spectacles, looking directly at Marcus. He asked the question that David and I had been praying for. He said, "Mr. Vance, I want to be absolutely clear. Are there any other assets, accounts, physical holdings, or valuables, either domestic or foreign, that are not listed on this affidavit?" The courtroom went silent. The air conditioner hummed in the background. This was the point of no return. If Marcus admitted there might be some oversight, he could claim negligence later. If he hesitated, he might save himself. But Marcus was a narcissist. He believed that if he could not see the gold buried in the snow, then the law could not see it either. He leaned into the microphone. He did not blink. He said, "No, Your Honor." He said, "This is everything I have in the world. I am effectively destitute." I felt a rush of adrenaline that was sharper than any drug. David Rossi kept his face neutral, but under the table he wrote a single word on his legal pad in thick black ink: perjury. It was done. The trap had snapped shut with the force of a bear trap. Marcus had just committed a Class 3 felony in open court. He had turned a greedy divorce tactic into a federal crime. He thought he was protecting $3 million. In reality, he had just traded his freedom for a lie. The judge nodded and accepted the affidavit into evidence. He banged his gavel and granted Marcus the temporary hardship status he requested. Marcus stood up and walked back to his table. He shot a quick smug grin at Tiffany, who was sitting in the back row. He looked at me with triumphant pity. He thought he had won. He thought he had outsmarted the system and left me with nothing. He had no idea that he had just signed his own arrest warrant. I looked at him and allowed myself a small, genuine smile. Enjoy your victory lap, Marcus. The finish line is a prison cell. The sharp rip of brown packing tape echoed off the bare walls of the penthouse like a gunshot. I smoothed the tape over the top of the cardboard box and stacked it by the door. The living room was almost unrecognizable. The art was gone, leaving pale ghosts on the paint where the frames had hung for years. The bookshelves were empty. The Persian rugs were rolled up. I had spent the last 48 hours stripping the skin off this marriage until only the bones remained. To an outsider looking in, I was a broken woman retreating with her tail between her legs. But I was not packing to leave. I was clearing the stage for the final act. I picked up my phone and checked the weather app for the 10th time that hour. The forecast had not changed. In fact, it had intensified. A polar vortex was descending on Chicago. The meteorologists were calling for sub-zero temperatures and heavy snow starting late Friday night. It was going to be the kind of storm that shuts down the city, the kind of storm that blinds cameras and keeps neighbors away from their windows. It was dangerous weather for most people, but for a desperate man trying to dig up a safe, it would look like perfect cover. I opened my message thread with Marcus. I typed the words that would seal his fate. I will be out by Friday at 6 p.m. The keys will be under the mat. Do not come before then. I hit send. I knew exactly how his mind worked. He was paranoid. He knew that once I was gone, he had a small window before the bank took possession or the realtors started showing the property. He needed to get that safe out of the ground. But he also needed privacy. If he came on Saturday, the ground might be frozen too hard to dig. If he waited until next week, the house might not be empty. Friday night was his only option. He would see my text and think I was giving him a victory. He would think I was fleeing before the storm hit. He would think the blizzard was his ally, cloaking his actions in darkness and wind. My phone buzzed with his reply almost instantly. It was a single thumbs-up emoji. No words, no goodbye. Just a dismissive gesture from a man who thought he had already won. I looked out the window at the gray sky. The clouds were heavy and low, pregnant with the coming snow. I could feel the temperature dropping in the house as I turned down the thermostat. I wanted it cold. I wanted the house to feel dead when he walked in. I walked over to the sliding glass door one last time. The patch of gray snow in the corner was still there, mocking me. But now I looked at it with affection. That patch of dirt was about to make me very rich. I picked up my purse and the last box of my personal items. I was leaving the house, but I was not going far. I was just moving my seat from the stage to the audience. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me, knowing that the next time it opened, it would be by the hand of a felon. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now all I had to do was wait for the storm. The doorbell rang with a sharp insistence that grated against my nerves. I did not have to guess who it was. Marcus was at work avoiding me until the deadline, and Tiffany had already done her damage. That left only one person, Joyce. I opened the door, and there she stood, wrapped in a fur coat that probably cost more than my college tuition. She did not say hello. She pushed past me into the foyer, her eyes scanning the hallway like a vulture circling a carcass. She was here for an inspection. She wanted to make sure the help had not stolen the silverware on the way out. She walked through the house with a clipboard in her hand, ticking off items from a mental list. She checked the kitchen drawers to ensure the high-end appliances were still there. She opened the linen closet to count the Egyptian cotton towels. It was humiliating, but I followed her silently, my phone clutched in my hand. I had the voice memo app open and recording. I knew Joyce. She could never resist the urge to brag when she thought she had the upper hand. She stopped in front of the 85-inch television mounted above the fireplace. She ran a manicured hand along the black bezel, checking for scratches. She turned to me with a sneer. She warned me not to even think about taking it off the wall. She said she knew I was desperate for cash, but that television was company property. She told me she had the serial number written down, and if it was missing on Saturday morning, she would call the police herself. I stood there with my head bowed, playing the role of the defeated daughter-in-law. I apologized softly. I told her I had no intention of taking anything that did not belong to me. My submission seemed to embolden her. She laughed a dry, cruel sound. She looked around the empty penthouse and shook her head. She said it was pathetic, really. She said I had 5 years to secure my future, and I blew it. She told me I was leaving with nothing because I was worth nothing. Then she got careless. The arrogance of victory made her loose. She walked over to the window and looked down at the snow-covered city. She sighed happily. She said she hated Chicago winters. She said she could not wait to get out of this freezing hellhole. She turned to me and the truth spilled out. She said that once Marcus finished his little project in the backyard this weekend, things were going to change. She said he promised to buy her a villa in Boca Raton with the proceeds. She said she had already picked out the curtains for her ocean view bedroom. My heart skipped a beat. She knew. She knew about the money buried in the yard. She called it proceeds. She knew it was illegal, and she was expecting her cut. I kept my face blank, but my thumb tightened on my phone. She had just admitted to being an accomplice. She was not just a greedy mother-in-law, she was a co-conspirator in a federal crime. She adjusted her coat and told me to make sure the floors were clean before I left. She walked out the door without a backward glance. I stopped the recording and saved the file. She thought she was coming to protect a television. She had just sold out her son for a hypothetical house in Florida. It was 5:45 on Friday evening, and the sky had turned a bruised purple color that promised violence. The wind was already whipping through the streets, stinging my cheeks, as I dragged my 2 large suitcases down the front steps of the building. I had timed this perfectly. I knew the doorman was watching. I knew the neighbors were watching. I needed everyone to see the broken woman leaving her life behind. A yellow taxi was waiting at the curb, its engine idling and puffing white exhaust into the freezing air. I made a show of struggling with the bags. I wanted to look weak. The driver, a kind man with a thick mustache, jumped out to help me. He loaded the luggage into the trunk with a grunt. I turned back to look at the penthouse one last time. I let my shoulders sag. I wiped a fake tear from my cheek. Then I climbed into the back seat and told the driver loudly enough for the doorman to hear that I needed to go to O'Hare International Airport. I said I was catching the red-eye to San Francisco. The car pulled away, merging into the Friday night traffic. I watched my building disappear in the rearview mirror. But as soon as we turned the corner and were out of sight, the act dropped. I leaned forward and tapped on the plexiglass divider. I told the driver I had changed my mind. I handed him a $50 bill. I asked him to drop me off 2 blocks over behind the old row houses on Cedar Street. He looked confused, but money talks. He pulled over and unloaded my bags on the dark sidewalk. I waited until his taillights faded into the distance. The street was empty, the cold keeping everyone indoors. I grabbed my bags and moved quickly. I did not walk toward the airport. I circled back, moving through the narrow alleyway that ran behind my building. My destination was not California. It was the crumbling brick house directly across the street from my own front door. Ms. Hattie was waiting for me. She opened the back door before I even knocked. She ushered me inside quickly and locked the deadbolt behind me. Her house smelled of stale cigarette smoke and peppermint tea. It was warm and cluttered, a sharp contrast to the cold minimalism of the penthouse I had just left. She did not say a word. She just pointed a gnarled finger toward the front room. I left my bags in this hallway and walked into her living room. The lights were off. The heavy curtains were drawn, but there was a small gap left intentionally open. I approached the window and looked out. It was the perfect vantage point. From here, I had a direct line of sight to my driveway and the side gate that led to the backyard. I was no longer the prey running for safety. I was the hunter sitting in a blind waiting for the buck to step into the clearing. I checked my watch. 6 o'clock. Right on cue, a pair of headlights swept across the street. A black Range Rover pulled up to the curb. Marcus was here. The show was about to begin. The grandfather clock in the corner of the room chimed once, marking 1 in the morning. The sound was hollow and deep, vibrating through the floorboards of Miss Hattie's dark living room. We sat in silence like two ghosts haunting the window. The air inside smelled of peppermint tea and old dust, but outside the world was screaming. The polar vortex had arrived with a vengeance. The wind howled down the narrow street, shaking the single-pane glass in its rotting frames. Snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets, turning the neighborhood into a blurred white wasteland. It was the kind of weather that erased the world. It was a night where no one would be watching. It was exactly what Marcus had been waiting for. I held my porcelain teacup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into my cold fingers. Miss Hattie sat in her wingback armchair, perfectly still. Her eyes were sharp and fixed on the street across the way. We were the audience for a play that was about to reach its tragic climax. The streetlights flickered, struggling to cut through the density of the storm. For a long time, there was nothing but the swirling, white chaos. Then the darkness at the end of the block shifted. A large shape detached itself from the shadows. It was a black pickup truck, not the luxury Range Rover Marcus usually drove. He had rented a utility vehicle for the dirty work. The truck moved slowly, creeping down the street like a predator stalking prey. The most chilling detail was the darkness of the vehicle itself. The headlights were off. He was driving blind, navigating the storm by memory and the faint ambient light of the city. It was a dangerous move that screamed criminal intent. A man coming home to his wife does not drive with his lights off in a blizzard. A man coming to hide a felony does. The truck turned into my driveway, the tires crunching softly on the fresh powder. The wind swallowed the sound of the engine. He pulled all the way up to the garage door, positioning the truck to block the view from the street. The driver's side door opened. A figure stepped out into the biting cold. He was dressed in black from head to toe, wearing a heavy parka and a scarf wrapped around his face. But I knew that walk. I knew the arrogant set of those shoulders. It was Marcus. He stood by the truck for a moment, scanning the neighborhood. He looked left. He looked right. He looked directly at the dark window where Miss Hattie and I were sitting. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. But he saw only a dilapidated house with the lights off. He did not see the two pairs of eyes tracking his every move. Satisfied that he was alone, he reached into the bed of the truck and pulled out a long, heavy object. It was a pickaxe. He walked toward the side gate, disappearing into the shadows of the house. Miss Hattie set her cup down on the saucer with a soft clink. She leaned forward and whispered that the devil has arrived to dig his own grave. I nodded and reached for my phone. The performance had begun. I watched the scene unfold on my iPad screen through the hidden camera I had mounted in the birdhouse. The night vision filter turned my backyard into a grainy green hellscape. The wind was screaming into the microphone, creating a distorted audio track that sounded like the earth itself was in pain. Marcus was hacking at the frozen ground with a pickaxe. He was not the composed executive anymore. He was a desperate animal. Every swing was violent and clumsy. He was fighting the frost line that had hardened the earth into concrete over the last 2 days. Tiffany was standing next to him, and she looked completely out of place. She was wearing a clear plastic raincoat over her designer outfit. It looked ridiculous. She held a shovel like it was a foreign object contaminated with disease. She was not digging. She was scraping at the loose dirt Marcus chipped away. Even through the grainy footage, I could see her body language screaming with irritation. She stopped moving and threw her shovel onto the snow. I turned up the volume on the tablet, trying to hear her over the wind. She was screaming at him. Her voice was shrill and thin against the gale. She held up her hand. She had broken a nail. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud in the dark room. Here they were committing a federal felony, digging up the evidence of grand larceny, and she was worried about a manicure. Marcus stopped swinging. He did not comfort her. He grabbed her arm roughly and shoved the shovel back into her hands. He pointed at the hole and shouted something that looked like a threat. This was the reality of their relationship. Without the money and the luxury, there was no love. There was only greed and panic. They went back to work. The snow was swirling around them, filling the hole almost as fast as they could empty it. It took them an hour of back-breaking labor to reach the target. Then I heard it. A dull, heavy thud. Metal striking metal. Marcus dropped to his knees in the mud. He started clawing at the dirt with his gloved hands like a dog. He brushed away the soil, revealing the top of the heavy steel floor safe. He looked up at Tiffany and pumped his fist in the air. He thought he had found his salvation. He thought he was minutes away from driving off with $3 million in diamonds. He had no idea that the only thing he had successfully dug up was a one-way ticket to the penitentiary. I adjusted the gain on the digital audio receiver sitting on Ms. Hattie's coffee table. The wind outside was a constant roar, but the high-fidelity directional microphone I had hidden in the garden trellis was doing its job. On my laptop screen, the audio visualizer looked like a chaotic heart monitor. The green spikes represented the wind. The yellow spikes were the metallic clank of the shovel hitting the frozen earth. But I was waiting for the red spikes. I was waiting for the human voice to cut through the storm. On the video feed, Tiffany had reached her breaking point. She threw her shovel down into the snow and crossed her arms. I could see her shouting. Her body language was defiant. She was pointing at the house and then at the car. She was done. She was cold, and she was likely realizing that manual labor was not part of the luxury lifestyle she had signed up for. Marcus stood up from the hole. He looked like a madman. He grabbed her by the shoulders of her plastic raincoat and shook her. I held my breath and pushed the noise cancellation filter to the maximum setting. The background hiss of the blizzard faded away, leaving their voices chillingly clear in my headphones. Tiffany was screeching. She said she did not care about the money anymore. She said her hands were bleeding. She said she was going back to the car to turn on the heater. Then Marcus exploded. The waveform on my screen spiked red and stayed there. His voice was a guttural roar that carried perfectly over the distance. He screamed at her to shut her mouth. He told her she was not going anywhere. He pointed violently at the hole in the ground. He shouted, "Do you think I did this for fun? There is $3 million in that box, Tiffany. I stripped the entire employee pension fund to get this. This is not just cash. This is our life. This is the Senate seat you want so bad. So unless you want to be poor and in prison, you will pick up the damn shovel and dig." I sat back in my chair and exhaled. There it was, the smoking gun, the confession. He had just admitted to the specific crime. He admitted to stealing the pension fund. He admitted the amount. And he admitted the motive was political ambition. He had tied himself the money and Tiffany together in a nice, neat bow for the federal prosecutors. I hit the stop recording button and immediately uploaded the file to 3 different cloud servers. I named the file The End. They were still out there shivering and fighting in the mud, thinking they were digging for their future. They had no idea they had just dug their own graves. The digging was just a formality now. The trap had snapped shut. The pickaxe came down one last time, and the sound was unmistakable. Clang! It was a sharp, high-pitched ring that vibrated through the handle and up into Marcus' arms. It was not the dull thud of frozen earth or the crack of a tree root. It was steel striking steel. The noise seemed to echo in the small backyard, momentarily silencing the wind. Marcus froze. He looked up at Tiffany with wild eyes. He dropped the tool and fell to his knees in the slush. He was breathing hard, his breath coming in jagged white puffs. He started clawing at the mud with his gloved hands, frantically clearing away the loose dirt. Tiffany stopped complaining about the cold. She stepped closer, pointing the flashlight beam directly into the hole. The light cut through the swirling snow and illuminated the object of their obsession. It was the dark gray corner of a heavy-duty floor safe. It was caked in mud and grime, but to them it looked like the most beautiful thing in the world. Marcus shouted at her to grab the other handle. He wiped the sludge from the top of the box, exposing the steel grip. Tiffany hesitated for a second, looking at her ruined manicure, but the promise of what lay inside was too strong. She dropped into the mud beside him. They counted to 3. They heaved with everything they had. The safe was heavy, weighted down by its thick walls and its precious contents. It made a sucking sound as it broke free from the wet earth. They dragged it up the side of the hole and tipped it over onto the pristine white snow. It lay there like a dark coffin in the moonlight. The black metal was stark against the white ground. Marcus ripped off his muddy gloves. His hands were shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. He reached for the digital keypad, which was protected by a rubber weather cover. He punched in the code. 1984, the year he was born. The lock gave a mechanical whir and then a solid click. The sound was heavy and final. He grabbed the handle and pulled. The heavy steel door swung open on its hinges. The beam of the flashlight caught the contents and the reflection was blinding. Inside the safe was not just paper money. It was a hoard worthy of a pirate king. Rows of gold bullion bars were stacked neatly at the bottom. They glowed with a dull, heavy luster that seemed to generate its own warmth. On top of the gold were thick stacks of bearer bonds bound in plastic. Tucked into the corners were black velvet pouches that I knew contained the loose diamonds he had bought in Antwerp. It was $3 million of stolen wealth condensed into a 2-foot metal box. It was their ticket to power. It was the foundation of the political dynasty they wanted to build. The sight of it broke something inside Tiffany. She did not just smile. She let out a sound that was half scream and half laugh. It was a manic, terrifying sound that pierced the night air. She dropped the flashlight and reached into the safe with both hands. She grabbed a gold bar. She held it up to her face, rubbing the cold metal against her cheek as if it were a lover. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, reflecting the snow and the greed. She looked deranged. She started laughing harder, a hysterical cackle that rose above the wind. She looked at Marcus and screamed that they had done it. She said they were kings. She was so intoxicated by the sight of the gold that she did not notice the red and blue lights that had just turned onto the street. She did not hear the sirens that were about to drown out her laughter. She only saw the gold. And for a few seconds, she actually believed she had won. Tiffany was still clutching the gold bar to her chest, and her laughter was spiraling into the wind. Marcus was reaching into the safe to grab a stack of bonds, his face twisted in a rictus of greedy delight. They were drunk on their own success. They were so absorbed in the glow of the stolen wealth that they had forgotten the most basic rule of our home. I was the one who installed the smart security system. I was the one who had the admin passwords. And I was the one watching them from across the street with my finger hovering over the control panel on my iPad. I tapped the button labeled Exterior Floodlights All. The effect was instantaneous and violent. 6 industrial-grade LED security lights mounted along the roofline exploded to life simultaneously. It was like a flashbang grenade going off in the dark. 10,000 lumens of harsh blue-white light flooded the backyard, turning the night into an interrogation room. The shadows were obliterated instantly. The snow, which had been a dark canvas, suddenly glared with blinding intensity. Marcus and Tiffany screamed. It was a primal reaction to the sudden sensory overload. They threw their hands up to shield their eyes, stumbling back from the safe. Tiffany dropped the gold bar. It hit the frozen patio stones with a heavy, dull clank that sounded pathetic compared to her earlier triumph. They looked like cockroaches exposed in a kitchen when the lights are flipped on. They were blinking rapidly, trying to adjust to the glare, their pupils pinpricks of panic. They spun around wildly, looking for the source of the intrusion. They expected to see police officers with flashlights or neighbors yelling from the fence. But there was no one in the yard. Just the blinding light and the swirling snow. They were alone in the spotlight. Then I pressed the microphone icon on my screen. My voice was amplified through the high-definition Bose outdoor speakers hidden in the landscaping rocks. The sound was crisp and commanded the entire space, drowning out the wind. "Good evening, Marcus." He froze. His head snapped toward the house, his eyes searching the empty windows. He knew that voice. He had heard it across the dinner table for 5 years. But he had never heard it like this. It was the voice of God coming from everywhere and nowhere. I continued speaking slowly, savoring every syllable. "You know, I always told you we needed a water feature in the backyard. Thank you so much for digging the hole for my new swimming pool. You really saved me a fortune in contractor fees." Marcus stood there with his mouth open. His face had gone completely gray, the arrogance drained out of him, leaving him looking small and shriveled. He looked down at the safe and then up at the dark windows of the penthouse. He realized in that split second that the house was not empty. He realized that the silence had been a lie. He realized that while he was playing checkers, I had been playing chess. Tiffany looked at him with horror. She grabbed his arm, her long nails digging into his parka. She screamed at him, asking what was happening. She asked if I was in the house. Marcus pushed her away. He started to scramble, trying to close the heavy steel door of the safe. He was trying to hide the evidence. He was trying to put the genie back in the bottle, but it was too late. The stage was lit, the actors were in place, and the audience was about to arrive. Marcus did not waste time screaming back at the speakers. He knew that arguing with a ghost was futile. The voice from the sky had triggered his fight or flight response, and he chose flight instantly. He knew he could not lift the heavy safe back into the truck. The gold bars were too heavy to carry on foot. He made a split-second calculation. He grabbed the velvet pouches of diamonds and the thick stacks of bearer bonds, stuffing them into his coat pockets, until he looked deformed. He left the gold sitting in the snow. He left the open safe exposed. He turned and ran toward the driveway, slipping and sliding on the ice. Tiffany was screaming his name. She was scrambling out of the mud, trying to follow him, but her high heels were useless in the deep snow. She fell face first onto the patio, but Marcus did not even turn his head. He was moving with the desperation of a man who hears the prison gates closing behind him. He reached the black pickup truck, breathing like a steam engine. He yanked the driver's side door open and threw himself into the seat. He jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. He slammed the gear shift into reverse and stomped on the gas pedal. The engine revved. The wheels spun. But the truck did not move. It listed heavily to the left. It felt like the vehicle was sinking into the concrete. Marcus slammed his hands against the steering wheel and looked out the side mirror. The rear tire was not just flat. It was shredded. Long, jagged strips of rubber were flapping uselessly against the rim. He looked at the front tire. It was the same. Someone had taken a knife to them. Someone had slashed them methodically while he was busy digging. He froze. The realization hit him like a physical blow. This was not just Nia. Nia was a data analyst. She fought with spreadsheets and algorithms. She did not slash tires in a blizzard. She had help. He jumped out of the useless truck. The wind whipped his coat around him, threatening to spill the stolen bonds into the street. He spun around in a circle, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He scanned the dark houses on the street. He knew the penthouse was empty. If Nia was there, she would be at the window gloating. But the penthouse windows were dark. His gaze swept across the street and landed on the crumbling brick row house directly opposite our driveway. Ms. Hattie's house. It was the only house on the block with a direct line of sight to the yard. And there in the front window, just barely visible through the gap in the heavy curtains, was a flicker of movement. A shadow within a shadow. Marcus snapped. The facade of the civilized businessman evaporated completely. He reached into the waistband of his trousers beneath his parka. He pulled out a snub-nosed .38 caliber pistol. The metal was dark and deadly against the white snow. He did not care about the neighbors anymore. He did not care about the noise. He raised the gun and leveled it directly at the window where Ms. Hattie and I were sitting. His hand was shaking, but the intent was clear. He screamed into the wind, daring us to show our faces. He was a trapped rat, and he was ready to kill to get out of the cage. Marcus stood there with his arm extended and the barrel of the pistol trembling as he aimed it at the dark window. He was 1 pound of pressure on a trigger away from turning a financial crime into a murder charge. He took a breath to scream again, but the air was suddenly sucked out of the night. The silence was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the deafening crash of glass. The windows of the unmarked van parked down the street exploded outward. The side gate of my neighbor's yard burst open with a splintering crack. It was not a random arrival. It was a coordinated strike. From every shadow around him, figures clad in black tactical gear emerged like nightmares rising from the snow. They did not move like beat cops. They moved with the terrifying speed and precision of a military unit. Their body armor bore the bright yellow letters that every white-collar criminal fears most. FBI. A voice amplified by a megaphone cut through the wind with the force of a physical blow. It came from everywhere at once, echoing off the brick facades of the row houses. Federal agents. Drop the weapon. Drop it now. Marcus flinched. He spun around trying to find a target, but there were too many of them. He was surrounded. From the aerial view, it must have looked like a black ink stain collapsing inward on a single speck of white. Red laser sights danced across his chest and forehead, painting him like a Christmas tree. He was outmanned, he was outgunned, and he was completely exposed. For a second, he hesitated. His ego wrestled with his survival instinct. He looked at the gun in his hand as if he did not know how it got there. Do it. Drop it, or we will fire. The command was absolute. There was no negotiation. Marcus let out a sob of pure defeat. His fingers opened. The gun fell from his hand and landed in the snow with a soft thud. It was the sound of his life ending. Before the gun even settled, 3 agents were on him. They did not ask him to lie down. They hit him with the force of a freight train. He was lifted off his feet and slammed face first into the frozen driveway. The impact knocked the wind out of him. I heard the crunch of his expensive nose breaking against the ice even from across the street. They swarmed him, knees pressed into his back, pinning him to the ground. His face was mashed into the slush, the cold biting into his skin. He tried to struggle, but it was useless. Hands, rough and efficient, grabbed his wrists and wrenched them behind his back. The metallic ratchet of handcuffs tightening was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Tiffany was screaming near the patio. She was on her knees, holding her hands up in surrender, looking like a terrified child. An agent stood over her, keeping his rifle trained on the ground. One of the agents leaned down to Marcus's ear. He did not whisper. He spoke loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Marcus Vance, you are under arrest for federal embezzlement, wire fraud, and perjury. You have the right to remain silent. Marcus lifted his head slightly, spitting blood and snow. He looked toward my house one last time. His eyes were wide with shock and betrayal. He was looking for me. But I was not in the penthouse. I was sitting in the dark across the street, sipping tea and watching the justice system crush him. The snowflakes settled on his expensive coat, burying him just like he tried to bury the truth. The wolf was finally in a cage. Tiffany was not going quietly. While Marcus had crumbled under the weight of reality, Tiffany was fighting with the ferocity of a cornered cat. 2 agents had pulled her up from the snow, but she was kicking and thrashing, making it impossible to get the cuffs on her wrists. Her plastic raincoat was torn, hanging off one shoulder, and her immaculate blowout was now a wet, tangled mess plastered to her skull. I zoomed in with the camera. The high-definition lens captured every detail of her humiliation. Black streaks of waterproof mascara were running down her cheeks, turning her face into a grotesque mask of horror. She looked like a melting wax doll. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with hysteria. She demanded to speak to a manager. She demanded to speak to the director of the FBI. She was acting as if this were a bad service experience at a spa, rather than a felony arrest. She looked directly at the agent holding her left arm. She screamed that they were making a huge mistake. She shrieked that her father was Senator Davis. She told them that one phone call would end their careers. She threatened to sue them for every penny they had. It was pathetic. She was trying to wield power that she did not possess. Her father might be a senator, But even he could not make federal embezzlement charges disappear, especially when they were caught red-handed with the loot. When the threats did not work, she switched tactics instantly. She stopped kicking and went limp. She started sobbing, loud theatric gasps for air. She looked at the female agent standing in front of her. She screamed that she was pregnant. She yelled that she was carrying the heir to the Vance dynasty. She claimed they were hurting the baby. She tried to use her unborn child as a human shield, thinking that her condition gave her immunity from the law. She thought the world would stop spinning because she was carrying Marcus's child. The female agent did not flinch. She was a tall woman with eyes like flint. She stepped closer to Tiffany, ignoring the expensive perfume mixed with the smell of sweat and fear. She grabbed Tiffany's wrist and snapped the metal cuff tight against the skin. She leaned in close, her face inches from Tiffany's ruined makeup. She spoke with a voice that was colder than the wind swirling around them. She told Tiffany that she did not care who her father was. She said that federal prison has a very capable maternity ward. She told her she can give birth in a cell just like anyone else. Tiffany stopped screaming. Her mouth hung open in shock. The reality finally pierced her delusion. There would be no luxury suite. There would be no private doctors. There would be no baby shower. She was going to have her golden child behind bars. The agent spun her around and marched her toward the waiting van. Tiffany stumbled, her expensive boots dragging in the sludge, a broken queen stripped of her crown. The interrogation room was a box of sterile gray walls and humming fluorescent lights that sucked the color out of everything they touched. I stood on the other side of the one-way mirror, watching the man who used to rule my world. Marcus sat at the metal table, handcuffed to a steel ring bolt in the floor. He was not wearing his Italian suit. He was wearing a bright orange county jail jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. His hair was matted with dried sweat and blood from where his face had hit the driveway. He looked like a stranger. He looked like a ruin. David Rossi stood beside me, his arms crossed. He nodded at the guard by the door. It was time. We walked into the room. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind us, sealing us in with the prisoner. Marcus's head snapped up. When he saw me, a look of desperate hope washed over his face. It was pathetic. He actually thought I was there to save him. He thought his charm was still a currency that held value in this room. He leaned forward, the chains rattling against the metal table. He started talking immediately, his voice cracking with urgency. He called me baby. He used the pet name he had not used in 3 years. He told me that this was all a terrible mistake. He said the FBI had it wrong. He said he was holding that money for a client. He tried to spin a web of lies, but his hands were shaking so badly he could not weave the threads together. I sat down in the metal chair opposite him. I did not say a word. I just looked at him. I looked at the dark circles under his eyes. I looked at the bandage across his broken nose. I looked for the man I had married, but he was gone. In his place was a con artist who had run out of tricks. Marcus saw my silence and switched tactics. He reached out as far as the cuffs would allow, trying to touch my hand. He begged for mercy. He invoked our vows. He asked me to remember the good times. He said we were a team. He said he loved me. He said he did everything for us. He claimed that the diamonds and the gold were meant to secure our retirement, so we could travel the world just like I always wanted. He was crying now. Big theatrical tears rolled down his bruised cheeks. He pleaded with me to tell the agents that I knew about the money. He wanted me to lie. He wanted me to say I was an accomplice so that the charges would be diluted, or so he could claim spousal privilege. He was willing to drag me into prison with him, just to cushion his fall. I let him finish. I let him pour out every ounce of his manipulation until the room went silent. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I placed it on the table between us, screen facing up. Marcus looked at it confused. I told him that I found his version of love very interesting. I told him I wanted to play him a memory I cherished. I pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. It was the recording from the storm just hours ago. The sound of the wind filled the small room. Then Marcus's voice cut through the air, angry and hateful. She is a useless anchor, Tiffany. Once I get this money out of the ground, I am dumping her and her pathetic medical bills. She is nothing to me, a dead weight. I should have left her to rot years ago. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Marcus went pale. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He stared at the phone as if it were a bomb that had just detonated. He realized in that moment that I had heard everything. He realized that his performance of the grieving husband was an insult to my intelligence. He looked up at me and his eyes were dead. There was no more begging, no more charm. Just the hollow stare of a man who knows he is finished. I stood up and smoothed my skirt. I looked at his reflection in the mirror one last time. I told him that the useless woman was the one who put him in that chair. I told him to enjoy his retirement. I walked out of the room and I did not look back. The fluorescent lights of the federal conference room hummed with a low, steady vibration that seemed to amplify the tension in the air. Across the mahogany table sat Agent Miller and the court-appointed trustee responsible for liquidating Marcus's assets. They looked exhausted. The sheer volume of paperwork generated by a $3 million embezzlement case was staggering. David Rossi sat next to me, looking fresh and sharp in his navy suit. He had a leather portfolio in front of him, and a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips. Agent Miller slid a thick stack of documents toward us. He explained that the recovery of the assets was successful. The gold and diamonds had been authenticated. The total value was approximately $3.4 million due to the recent spike in gold prices and the high appraisal of the Antwerp diamonds. He stated that $3 million would be returned to the Vance Enterprises pension fund to make the victims whole. The remaining $400,000, which represented the appreciation and the personal funds Marcus had mixed in, would typically be seized by the state as proceeds of crime or used to pay legal fees. David raised a hand, gently stopping the agent mid-sentence. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a document that looked like it belonged in a museum, not a law office. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges. It smelled of cedar and old time. He placed it gently on the center of the table and smoothed it out with reverence. David asked Agent Miller if he was familiar with the property lines of the historic South Side District. He pointed to a faded ink line drawn on the surveyor map dated 1974. He explained that when the developer built the luxury condos where Marcus and I lived, they made a critical error. They assumed the fence line was the property line. They were wrong by exactly 6 feet. I leaned forward, watching the agent's eyes scan the map. David traced the line with his finger. He showed that the rear strip of the backyard, the exact spot where the rose bushes grew and where Marcus had buried the safe, did not belong to the condo association. It did not belong to Marcus. For the last 50 years, that strip of land had legally remained the property of the adjacent lot. The lot owned by Mrs. Hattie Mae Johnson. The agent looked up confused. He asked what this had to do with the asset forfeiture. David pulled out a second document. This one was crisp and white. It was a quitclaim deed signed 2 days ago and notarized. He explained that Mrs. Johnson, being a woman of immense generosity, had gifted that specific strip of land to her favorite neighbor. He pointed to my name on the deed. He said that technically and legally, I have been the owner of that land since Thursday. Then David dropped the hammer. He cited the Illinois statutes regarding treasure trove and abandoned property. He reminded the table that Marcus had sworn under oath in a court of law that he had 0 assets. By doing so, he legally abandoned any claim to the contents of that safe. He declared it ownerless. Under state law, if abandoned property is found buried on private land, it belongs to the landowner. The room went dead silent. The logic was airtight. Marcus had denied owning the money to hide it from me. In doing so, he had legally cut his own throat. The $3 million had to go back to the victims. That was justice. But the surplus, the $400,000 in profit from the gold appreciation, that was not Marcus's money anymore. It was mine. I looked at the deed. I thought about Ms. Hattie and her peppermint tea. She had known about the property line for years. She sat on that secret waiting for the perfect moment to use it as a weapon. She had given me the land not just to help me win, but to ensure Marcus lost everything. Agent Miller ran a hand over his face and let out a long sigh. He looked at the old map and then at David. He nodded slowly, admitting defeat. He said the restitution order would stand, but the remaining balance would be cut as a check to the landowner. I sat back in my chair and felt a weight lift off my chest. Marcus had dug a hole to bury his fortune. He ended up digging a gold mine for his ex-wife. I picked up the pen to sign the release forms. I was walking out of this marriage not just free, but with enough seed money to start a new life. And all because my husband was too arrogant to check a property survey. The large flat-screen television in my new apartment flickered, casting a cool blue glow across the room. I sat on the sofa with a glass of Pinot Noir, the remote resting loosely in my hand. I was not watching a show. I was watching the demolition of an empire. It was a montage of destruction, a slow-motion car crash that had been weeks in the making. The media had latched onto the Vance case with the ferocity of starving wolves. It had everything they loved: sex, money, politics, betrayal. And tonight the final dominoes were falling in rapid succession. Click. The screen cut to a chaotic press conference in Washington, D.C. Dozens of microphones were jammed onto a podium. Camera flashes went off like strobe lights, creating a disorienting strobe effect. Senator Davis Tiffany's father stepped up to the microphones. He looked 20 years older than he had a month ago. His skin was gray, his shoulders slumped. He did not look like a power broker anymore. He looked like a man standing in the ruins of his legacy. He spoke in a low, defeated monotone. He announced his immediate resignation from the Senate Ethics Committee and his decision not to seek re-election. He tried to frame it as a health issue, but the banner scrolling at the bottom of the screen told the real story. Senator linked to Vance embezzlement scandal. The investigations had revealed that Marcus had used the senator's influence to bypass regulatory checks for his shell companies. The senator had not just turned a blind eye. He had opened the door for the thief. Now the door was slamming shut on his career. He walked away from the podium, ignoring the shouted questions, a man erased by his daughter's greed. Click. The channel changed to an entertainment news program. The tone here was less somber and more salacious. The host, a woman with blindingly white teeth, leaned into the camera with a conspiratorial grin. She announced the exclusive scoop that had leaked from the Federal Detention Center's medical ward. The headline flashed in bright pink letters, "The Heir That Never Was." They showed a split screen of Tiffany being arrested in the snow and a medical document with sensitive information redacted. The host explained that during the mandatory intake, physical prison doctors discovered something interesting. Tiffany was not pregnant. She was not even close to being pregnant. There was no baby. There was no heir. It had been a silicone moon bump and a desperate lie. I took a sip of wine. It was the ultimate con. Tiffany had trapped Marcus with a phantom child. She had convinced him to steal millions to secure a future for a baby that did not exist. Marcus had destroyed his marriage, his company, and his freedom for a biological fiction. The irony was so sharp, it almost drew blood. Tiffany was now being charged with obstruction of justice and filing false statements. She was facing her own prison sentence, and she would be serving it alone, despised by the very man she tried to trap. Click. The scene shifted to a local news broadcast in the Chicago suburbs. A helicopter shot panned over a familiar luxury driveway. I recognized the house immediately. It was Joyce's sprawling estate. But the driveway was not filled with luxury cars. It was filled with moving vans and sheriff's deputies. A reporter stood on the sidewalk, bundled against the cold. She explained that with the collapse of Vance Enterprises, the assets of all guarantors were being called in. Joyce had leveraged her home to bail out Marcus's earlier business failures, believing the stolen millions would pay it all back. The gamble had failed. The bank was foreclosing. The camera zoomed in. Joyce came out of the front door. She was wearing her fur coat, but underneath she was wearing sweatpants. She was carrying two Louis Vuitton bags, clutching them to her chest as if they were life preservers. A deputy said something to her and pointed toward the street. She screamed at him. Even through the TV, I could see the spit flying from her mouth. She was indignant. She was furious. But then the deputy simply took her arm and escorted her off the property. She was left standing on the curb watching the movers carry her velvet sofas out to the auction truck. The Florida villa was gone. The mansion was gone. She was just an angry old woman on a sidewalk, bankrupt in every sense of the word. Click. The final image was the one I had been waiting for. It was a courtroom sketch, as cameras were not allowed inside for the sentencing. The artist had captured Marcus perfectly. He sat at the defense table, his head in his hands. The sketch showed the judge leaning forward, a black robe hanging like a shroud. The news anchor read the verdict with professional detachment. Marcus Vance found guilty on all counts of federal embezzlement, wire fraud, perjury, and money laundering. Sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. 15 years. He would walk in a man of 35 and walk out a broken man of 50. He had lost the money. He had lost the girl. He had lost his mother's respect. And he had lost me. I turned off the TV. The screen went black, leaving only my reflection in the dark glass. I looked calm. I looked whole. The storm had passed and the wreckage was cleared. I set the wine glass down on the table and stood up. I had a flight to catch in the morning. Not a fake flight to escape a husband, but a real flight to Paris to start a life funded by the stupidity of a man who thought he was smarter than his wife. The dominoes had all fallen. It was time to walk away. I sat across from Agent Miller in the sterile conference room of the FBI field office. The atmosphere was different today. There were no interrogation lamps, no handcuffs, and no tension. Miller looked almost relaxed. He slid a government-issued envelope across the metal table. He explained that under the federal whistleblower statutes, individuals who provide original information leading to the successful recovery of stolen assets are entitled to a percentage of the seizure. Because my evidence, the drone footage, the audio recordings, and the decrypted files, was the sole reason they recovered the pension fund and the gold, I qualified for the maximum payout. I opened the envelope. Inside was a treasury check. The numbers were stark and beautiful against the pale green paper. $342,000. It was 10% of the total recovered value plus the interest. This was not alimony. This was not a settlement. This was a bounty. I folded the check and placed it in my purse. I felt a surge of pride. Marcus had spent his life trying to steal a fortune. I had earned mine by stopping him. My next stop was not a celebration lunch, but a meeting with the asset liquidation officer at the bank that held the mortgage on the penthouse. The foreclosure on the Vance estate had been swift. The officer looked tired. He had a stack of files on his desk, but the file for the penthouse was sitting on top, marked with a red sticker. He looked at me with pity when I told him I wanted to make an offer on the property. He hesitated, tapping his pen against the file. He warned me that the property was what they called stigmatized. He said that between the high-profile FBI raid, the rumors of buried chemicals in the yard, and the notoriety of the embezzlement scandal, the unit had become toxic. No one wanted to buy a home where a felon had been dragged out face down in the snow. The real estate vultures were circling, but their offers were insulting. The value had plummeted to a third of what Marcus had paid. I smiled at him. I told him I was not superstitious. I told him I was looking for a fresh start, and I happened to know the layout of the unit very well. I made an all-cash offer using the whistleblower money and the rest of my personal savings. It was an aggressive lowball offer that would have been laughed out of the room 6 months ago. But today, the bank was desperate to get the Vance name off their books. The officer typed a few numbers into his computer, sighed, and extended his hand. The deal was done. A week later, I unlocked the front door of the penthouse. The air inside was still and cool. The movers had cleared out everything Marcus owned. The gaudy statues were gone. The heavy velvet curtains were gone. The space felt enormous and full of light. I walked through the empty rooms, the click of my heels echoing on the marble floors. I walked out onto the balcony and looked down at the city. The irony was delicious. Marcus had bought this place to prove he was a king. He had filled it with stolen money and lies. Now he was sitting in a 6 by 8 cell with a stainless steel toilet, and I was standing on his balcony, the sole owner of his castle. I had used the reward for catching him to buy the roof over my head. I took a deep breath of the crisp spring air. The bad energy people whispered about was gone. All I felt was the peace of total ownership. I raised my glass to the empty skyline. The house did not belong to a criminal anymore. It belonged to the woman who caught him. The Chicago winter was nothing but a memory now. The biting wind that had howled through the yard on the night of the arrest had been replaced by a gentle, humid breeze coming off Lake Michigan. The gray slush was gone. The frozen mud was gone. I sat on a plush white chaise lounge, letting the midday sun warm my skin. In front of me lay the sparkling expanse of a rectangular infinity pool. It was a beautiful piece of architecture lined with azure mosaic tiles that made the water look like a slice of the Caribbean dropped into the city. It was the ultimate irony. Marcus had spent hours in the freezing cold hacking at the earth to dig a hole for his secrets. I had simply hired a contractor to widen it, line it with concrete, and fill it with crystal clear water. He dug the grave. I turned it into an oasis. Ms. Hattie sat across from me. She looked regal in a wide-brimmed straw hat and a bright floral caftan that flowed around her like a robe. She wasn't just the eccentric neighbor across the street anymore. She was my partner. She was family. She raised her glass of iced tea, the ice cubes clinking softly against the crystal. I raised my glass of chilled Chardonnay. We tapped them together. We did not need to say a word. The silence between us was comfortable. It was the shared peace of two soldiers who had survived the war and were now enjoying the spoils of victory. I took a sip of the wine and looked directly into the camera lens. I broke the fourth wall because the performance was finally over. For 5 years I played a role. I was the gratitude wife. I was the charity case. I was the black sheep who should have been thankful just to be allowed at the table. Marcus called me a useless anchor. He thought that because I was quiet, I was blind. He thought that because I was patient, I was weak. That was his fatal mistake. He forgot the most basic rule of survival. The most dangerous person in the room is not the one shouting orders. It is the one sitting in the corner, watching, listening, and taking notes. I stood up and walked to the edge of the pool. I looked down at my reflection in the water. He wanted to bury his future in my backyard. Fine. I let him. I let him sweat. I let him bleed. And then I let the law finish the job. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to get physical. I fought him with the one thing he underestimated: intelligence. I fought him with property lines and tax codes. I fought him with his own arrogance. He built a trap made of greed, and all I had to do was wait for him to step into it. Now Marcus is sitting in a 6 by 8 cell wearing shoes that don't fit and eating food that has no taste. He has 15 years to think about that property line. Tiffany is bankrupt and facing perjury charges alone. Joyce is likely arguing with a motel manager somewhere in the suburbs. And I am here. The camera began to pull back, rising slowly into the air. I became a figure of white against the vibrant blue of the water and the lush green of the manicured lawn. The view expanded. The fence line, the famous 6-foot strip of land that changed everything, became a clear border below. The camera rose higher, revealing the rooftops of the neighborhood, the brick row house where Ms. Hattie sat watch, and finally the majestic skyline of Chicago, rising in the distance like a fortress of steel and glass. I am not a victim of fraud. I am not a scorned woman. I am the owner of the land. I am the owner of the truth. And most importantly, I am the queen of my own life. The best revenge isn't just living well. The best revenge is taking everything they thought you weren't worthy of and making it yours. The screen faded to black as the sun continued to shine on my empire. The most powerful lesson from Nia's journey is that silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Marcus fell because his arrogance blinded him to his wife's intelligence. He saw a dependent victim where there was actually a master strategist. Nia proves that in the face of betrayal, emotional outbursts yield nothing but calculated patience yields everything. She didn't just get angry, she got the receipts. This story reminds us that the sharpest weapon is not a raised voice, but a calm mind armed with knowledge. The ultimate power move is turning your enemy's greed into your own abundance. If you enjoyed this masterclass in cold calculated justice, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the queen always protects the board.